I stayed very still, barely breathing, as their voices drifted through the narrow opening of the door, softened by distance but sharp enough to cut through the quiet, and I realized how easy it was to disappear when people wanted you gone, how quickly a lifetime of being needed could turn into being inconvenient, because no one came looking for me, no one opened the door to check if I had really left. And that absence told me more than anything they could have said directly to my face, so I leaned slightly closer, careful not to let my shoes scrape the floor, and focused on the rhythm of their conversation, the way Emily spoke first, always first, her tone calm and precise as if she were discussing something routine rather than standing just a few feet away from the man we had both lost, and then Daniel responded, quieter, hesitant in a way I had not heard since he was a boy trying to explain a mistake. Except now there was no innocence in it, only tension, the kind that builds when someone knows they are crossing a line but keeps going anyway, and I pressed my hand more firmly against the wall, grounding myself in something solid as the weight of that realization settled in, because grief had not changed them overnight, this had been forming long before today, long before the memorial, long before the carefully chosen flowers and the polite condolences, and I thought about the past few months. The small things I had dismissed at the time, the conversations that ended when I entered the room, the decisions that were made without asking my opinion, the subtle shift in how Emily spoke to me, always respectful on the surface but with something colder underneath, something calculating, and I felt that pattern tightening now, like threads pulling into a shape I could finally see, and for a moment I closed my eyes, not out of weakness but to steady the rising clarity. Because once you begin to understand something like this, you cannot pretend you do not, and when I opened them again, I listened more carefully, catching fragments of words that felt out of place in a memorial, words like paperwork and timing and signatures, spoken in low voices that carried just enough urgency to confirm what my instincts had already begun to piece together, and I felt something inside me shift, not breaking, not collapsing, but changing direction, because whatever they were discussing was not about honoring the man we had just buried, it was about what came after, about control, about ownership, about decisions that had already been made without me, and I realized then that standing in that hallway, unseen and unheard, I was finally in a position I had not been in for a very long time. I was no longer being managed, no longer being guided away from the truth, I was outside of their plan, and that meant, for the first time, I could see it clearly, and I stayed exactly where I was, silent, patient, waiting for the pieces to fall into place, because whatever they were trying to keep from me, I was already closer to it than they realized. The words became clearer the longer I stood there, as if the silence itself was adjusting to let me hear what I was never meant to hear, and then Emily said something that made my fingers tighten against the wall, something so calm, so certain, that it did not sound like a plan anymore but a conclusion they had already reached. She said that everything had been handled ahead of time, that there would be no complications if they followed the timeline exactly as discussed, and Daniel asked a question in a low voice, the kind of question that carries doubt even when the answer has already been decided. He asked if it was really necessary to do it this way, and there was a pause, a brief one, but long enough for me to understand that he was not in control of what was happening, not anymore, and Emily answered him with a steadiness that left no room for argument. She said that it was the only way to avoid delays, that if certain documents had been presented earlier, there might have been resistance, and I felt something inside me settle into a quiet, unmistakable awareness, because she was not speaking in possibilities, she was speaking in outcomes, and that meant the decisions had already been made without me, finalized in rooms I had not been invited into, signed on papers I had never seen, and Daniel exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible but heavy with something I could not quite name, and then he said my name again, softer this time, followed by words that made everything align with a clarity that almost felt unreal. He said that I would not understand, that it would only upset me, that it was better this way, and for a moment I almost stepped away from the door, almost chose not to hear the rest. Because there is a point where the truth stops being something you search for and becomes something you have to face, but I stayed, because walking away would not undo what had already been set in motion, and Emily continued, her voice lowering slightly as if she was moving closer to him. She said that everything had already been transferred, that the house, the accounts, all of it had been secured exactly as planned, and she reminded him that there had been no objections because everything had been processed at the right time. And I understood what she meant by that. I understood it in a way that did not require any further explanation, because timing like that does not happen by accident, it happens when someone is no longer there to question it, and the realization did not come with shock or anger, not in the way I would have expected. It came with a kind of stillness, a quiet shift in perspective that made everything around me feel distant and sharply defined at the same time. And I thought about the last few weeks, about the way paperwork had been mentioned casually, about the way certain conversations had been redirected whenever I tried to ask simple questions, and I saw now how carefully everything had been arranged, how every step had been taken while I was still inside the house, still believing I was part of the decisions being made, and I let out a slow breath, silent enough that it would not carry through the door, because what mattered now was not how I felt about it, what mattered was what I knew. And what I knew was that they believed I had already left, that I was no longer listening, that whatever they were building would go forward without interruption, and that belief, more than anything else, was the first advantage I had been given all morning. For a few seconds I did not move at all, because when something that important settles into place, even the smallest movement feels unnecessary, and I let the silence do its work while their conversation continued, quieter now, more relaxed, as if they believed the difficult part was already behind them, and I could hear it in the way Daniel spoke next. The tension in his voice easing just slightly as he asked what would happen next, what they were supposed to tell me when everything became official, and there it was again, that careful phrasing, not if but when, not discussion but execution, and Emily responded without hesitation, telling him that by the time I realized anything had changed, it would already be too late to question it, that everything had been structured in a way that made it appear natural, expected, even beneficial for me, and I found myself almost admiring the precision of it, the way she described each step as if she had rehearsed it, refined it, removed every possible obstacle until there was nothing left but a straight path forward. And Daniel hesitated again, asking whether I would have somewhere to go, and for the first time there was something softer in his voice, something that reminded me of the boy who used to ask if I would be home when he got back from school, and Emily answered him in a tone that was not unkind but entirely practical, saying that arrangements like that could be handled later, that there were options, places designed for people in my situation, and the way she said it made it sound reasonable, almost thoughtful, as if removing me from my own home could be framed as a form of care, and I felt the full meaning of that settle into me with a clarity that did not need explanation, because it was not just about ownership or control, it was about rewriting my place in their lives, reducing it to something manageable, something that could be relocated, and I stood there in that hallway, listening to my future being discussed as if it were a scheduling detail, and I realized that this had not started today. It had not even started in the past few weeks, it had been building quietly, patiently, in conversations I had not been part of, decisions made over dinners I had not been invited to, signatures placed on documents I had never seen, and suddenly all the small moments I had dismissed began to return with a different meaning, the times Emily had insisted on handling paperwork for convenience, the times Daniel had reassured me that everything was under control, the subtle way they had begun to speak about the house as if it already belonged to them, and I saw it now not as a series of coincidences but as a pattern, deliberate and consistent, designed to lead to this exact moment, and I let out another slow breath, steady and quiet, because what I was feeling was no longer confusion or even hurt, it was recognition, the kind that comes when you finally see something for what it is, and I understood then that they believed I had already accepted my role in all of this, that I would step aside quietly, that I would trust them without question, and that belief, more than anything else, was what made their plan possible, because it meant they were not expecting resistance, they were not preparing for it, and as I stood there, just outside the room where they thought they were in control, I realized that the most important thing I could do was remain exactly where I was, unseen, unheard, and fully aware, because now that I understood what they had done, I also understood something they had not considered at all, that plans built on silence can be undone by the person who finally chooses to listen. Their voices softened after that, as if the hardest part of their conversation had already passed, and I could hear the faint shift of chairs, the subtle movement of people who believed they had reached an understanding, and for a moment I considered stepping away, not because I had heard enough, but because I understood enough, and there is a difference between the two. But then Emily said something that held me in place. Something so precise it felt rehearsed. She said that everything had been finalized before the memorial for a reason, that timing mattered, that it ensured there would be no interference, and Daniel asked what she meant by that, his voice lower now, almost cautious, and she explained it in a way that made the entire plan unfold in my mind with startling clarity. She said that certain approvals had been easier to secure while things were still unsettled, that people asked fewer questions when emotions were high and attention was focused elsewhere, and I felt the meaning of that settle into me with a quiet certainty, because I knew exactly when those days had been, the days when I had been distracted, grieving, trusting, the days when I had signed papers without reading them as carefully as I should have, believing they were routine, believing they were part of closing accounts or organizing records, and now those small, ordinary moments rearranged themselves into something far more deliberate, something structured, and I realized that what they had done was not sudden, it was patient, layered, built over time in a way that made it nearly invisible until it was complete. And Daniel let out a breath, longer this time, and said that he did not like the way it sounded, that it felt wrong, and there was a pause, a longer one, as if even Emily had to choose her words carefully, and when she spoke again her voice carried a calm that was almost reassuring. She said that nothing about it was wrong, that everything had been done legally, properly, that they had simply made decisions that needed to be made, and that I would be better off not having to manage things on my own. And I understood then that this was how they justified it, not as something taken, but as something handled, something improved, something they believed I could not do for myself, and I found that more revealing than anything else, because it meant they were not expecting confrontation, they were expecting acceptance, and I stayed there in that narrow strip of hallway, listening to the version of my life they had already decided on, and I realized that what mattered now was not correcting them in this moment, not stepping back into that room and demanding explanations, because that would only give them time to adjust, to prepare, to close whatever gaps still existed, and instead I did the opposite. I remained still, I let them finish, I let them believe that their plan was intact, because the one thing they had not accounted for, the one detail they had overlooked completely, was that I had been present long enough to understand everything they thought I would never know, and that quiet understanding, held in silence, was far more powerful than anything I could have said out loud. I waited until their voices faded into something softer, less urgent, until the sound of chairs moving and footsteps shifting signaled that the conversation was ending, and only then did I step back from the door, not quickly, not in a way that would draw attention, but with the same quiet control I had held on to since the moment Daniel asked me to leave, because there was no reason to rush now, no reason to reveal anything I had just learned, and I walked slowly down the hallway, past the framed photographs of families I did not know, past the small table with neatly arranged condolence cards, until I reached the exit doors, and for a brief moment I paused there, looking at my reflection in the glass, noticing how composed I appeared, how nothing on the surface betrayed the shift that had taken place inside me, and I realized that this was exactly why their plan had worked for as long as it had, because I had always been the one who stayed calm, who trusted, who believed that the people closest to me would act with care, and I understood now that this version of me, the one they expected, was something I could still use, not as a weakness, but as an advantage. So I stepped outside into the cool air, letting it settle around me, grounding me in the present moment, and I took a slow breath, not to steady myself, but to think clearly about what came next, because reacting immediately would only play into their expectations, it would give them the opportunity to explain, to adjust, to close whatever gaps remained, and what I needed now was time to understand the full scope of what had been done, time to confirm what I had heard, time to move carefully in a way they would not anticipate, and as I stood there, I began to recall something my husband had said years ago, something simple that had never seemed important until now. He had told me that if anything ever felt unclear, if anything ever seemed out of place, there was one person I should speak to before making any decisions, and at the time I had nodded without thinking much about it, because I had never imagined a situation where I would need that kind of guidance. But now the memory returned with a clarity that felt almost deliberate, and I realized that while Daniel and Emily had been planning quietly, making decisions in rooms I had not entered, there were still parts of our life that had been arranged long before any of this began, connections that did not belong to them, safeguards they might not even be aware of, and I felt a quiet sense of direction settle into place, not urgency, not panic, but something far more controlled, and I reached into my purse, my fingers brushing against the familiar shape of my phone, not to call anyone yet, not to act impulsively, but to remind myself that I was not as isolated as they believed, that there were still steps I could take without them knowing, and as I turned away from the building, walking toward the parking lot where my car was waiting, I understood something with complete certainty, that they had asked me to leave because they believed it would remove me from the situation, but in reality, it had given me exactly what I needed: distance, clarity, and the freedom to decide my next move without interruption. I did not start the engine right away, even after I reached my car, even after I closed the door and the outside noise faded into a distant hush, because there was something about that moment that demanded stillness, not hesitation, but intention, and I sat there with my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, staring through the windshield at nothing in particular while everything rearranged itself in my mind with quiet precision. And for the first time since that morning began, I allowed myself to think not as a mother, not as a widow, but as someone who needed to understand exactly where she stood, and I realized how carefully I had been positioned over time, how subtly my role had been reduced from decision-maker to observer, from participant to someone who was simply informed. After the fact, and I could trace it back now, not to one moment, but to a series of small shifts that had seemed harmless at the time, the way Emily would step in to handle conversations with accountants, the way Daniel would reassure me that everything was being taken care of, the way I had been encouraged to rest, to step back, to let them manage things while I focused on grieving, and I had accepted it because it sounded reasonable, because it sounded caring, because it came from people I trusted, and sitting there in the quiet of my car, I understood that trust had been the foundation they built everything else on, not broken, not taken, but redirected, slowly, patiently, until it worked in their favor, and I exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, but out of recognition, because once you see something clearly, there is a kind of calm that follows, a clarity that replaces uncertainty. And I reached into my purse again, this time pulling out my phone and turning it over in my hand without unlocking it, because I was not ready to make a call yet, not until I had thought through what needed to be done, and I considered my options carefully, not emotionally, not reactively, but step by step, the way I had approached every important decision in my life, and one thing became certain almost immediately: confronting them directly would only serve them, it would give them the opportunity to explain, to justify, to reshape the narrative in a way that made me seem unreasonable, and I would not give them that advantage, not now, not after everything I had just learned, and instead I thought about what I needed, not what I felt, but what I needed in order to move forward with clarity. I needed information, I needed confirmation, I needed to see exactly what had been signed, what had been transferred, what had been decided in my absence, and more importantly, I needed to do it without alerting them, because the moment they realized I knew, everything would change, and I would lose the one position that currently worked in my favor, the fact that they believed I was unaware, and I leaned back slightly in my seat, letting that thought settle in fully, because it was not a small advantage, it was the kind that could determine everything that followed, and as I finally started the engine, the quiet hum filling the space around me, I knew that the next steps I took would not be guided by emotion or urgency, but by something far more deliberate, because they had spent time building their plan in silence, and now, without them realizing it, I was about to do the same. It did not take long before the first inconsistency revealed itself, not in a dramatic way, not as something obvious or alarming, but as a detail that simply did not align with what I remembered: a document filed under a category it had never belonged to before, dated correctly but placed incorrectly, and I picked it up carefully, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to be precise. And as I read through it slowly, line by line, I noticed the language was formal, expected, but the structure carried something else, a subtle shift in how authority was described, how decisions were attributed, and I realized that while the document appeared legitimate on the surface, it relied heavily on timing and assumption, on the idea that I would not question it closely, and I set it aside, not with alarm, but with recognition, because this was exactly what I had anticipated, not a single mistake, but a series of small, overlooked details that only mattered when someone chose to look directly at them, and I continued through the drawer, reviewing each file with the same steady focus, not rushing, not reacting, simply observing, and the pattern became clearer with each page: signatures that matched but contexts that did not, approvals that aligned too neatly with moments when I had been distracted, and I felt a quiet certainty take hold, not based on suspicion anymore, but on evidence. And when I finally reached the end of the stack, I leaned back slightly in the chair, allowing the full picture to settle into place, because what they had built was careful, but it was not flawless. It depended on silence, on trust, on the assumption that I would never look beyond what was presented to me, and that assumption, more than anything else, was where their plan began to unravel, and I reached for my phone once more, this time without hesitation, scrolling back to the name I had paused on earlier, and I pressed call, holding the phone to my ear as it rang, each tone steady and measured, until a familiar voice answered, calm, professional, unchanged by time, and I introduced myself without explanation, because I knew he would understand the significance of the call itself, and I asked for a meeting, not urgently, not emotionally, but directly, and when he agreed without asking questions, I felt the final piece of my direction fall into place, and after I ended the call, I sat there for a moment longer, not to reflect, but to confirm what I already knew, that everything moving forward would be done on my terms, quietly, carefully, without revealing what I had learned, and I stood up from the desk, placing the documents back exactly as I had found them, leaving no indication that anything had been reviewed, no sign that anything had changed, because from their perspective, nothing had, and as I walked out of the study, turning off the light behind me, I understood something with complete clarity, that they had asked me to leave believing it would remove me from the situation, but instead, it had placed me in the one position they had never prepared for, the position of someone who knows the truth and chooses not to reveal it yet, and that, more than anything else, was where my advantage truly began.